Hello, everyone. Welcome to Education in Crisis, Rethinking Education in Post-Pandemic South Asia Conference. I'm Uma Pradhan, one of the co-conveners of this conference, along with our colleagues Karen Valentin and Mohini Gupta. We will now begin the program. This conference is organized by Education South Asia Initiative based at the Contemporary South Asian Studies program of Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, University of Oxford. We have been supported by Wilson College and the University of Oxford's ESRC Impact Acceleration account. The idea of this conference was born out of Education South Asia Initiative. This initiative began with the objective of creating space for dialogue between academics, policymakers, and practitioners, and across South Asian countries. The initial work for this event was laid down during my ongoing Leave Hume Early Career Fellowship and Visions of Education project that was supported by Global Challenges Research Fund. Both projects explore crisis as method to understand the significance of social and political moment that in which we live. In the ongoing COVID crisis, we have lived and witnessed the vulnerabilities and inequalities in our region. It has changed the way we live and think about our lives, and it has also created a potent space and time to collectively reflect on these realities, reimagine our futures, and undertake imaginative forms of action. The challenges posed by crisis, such as the ongoing pandemic, demand that we go beyond the disciplinary and national boundaries. Bringing these conversations together across disciplinary and national boundaries not only help us to better understand the region, but also strengthen the relationship within the region, as well as South Asia and other regions. Over the next 2 days of this conference, through different roundtables and paper presentation panels, we will be exploring a simple and yet a crucial question. In what ways do we need to rethink education in South Asia? As South Asia endures the devastating second and now third wave of the pandemic, our education systems are likely to be overwhelmed by an even greater crisis than ever before. And the pandemic has not only exposed existing socioeconomic and political fault lines, it has also increased enduring societal inequalities. In addition, we are challenged by emerging new forms of crisis in education. Overcoming these challenges will require rethinking education, the theme of this conference. And in this conference, we take post-pandemic context of South Asia both as a lens to understand the crisis as well as a site to explore the existing challenges in education. When we put out the call for papers, we hadn't imagined the response would be so enthusiastic. We received excellent abstracts from across different countries in South Asia. We received around 270 abstracts covering a wide variety of themes. Over today and tomorrow, we'll have an opportunity to listen to a very rich presentation made by more than 100 speakers in both synchronous and asynchronous formats. We have 24 speakers across 4 roundtables, 32 research presentations across 8 paper panels, 19 recorded videos in Innovation Spotlight series, and 26 paper presentations which are recorded and uploaded in our YouTube channel. We have also invited several people to contribute to our Think Piece blog series. And as you will see throughout these various components of the conference, we have tried our best to represent as many regions and themes as possible. And we will be live streaming all these sessions through our YouTube channel as well. By the time we closed our conference registration yesterday, we had already received around 840 registration, and these registrations were from at least 20 countries around the world. We are very honored and humbled by your response, And we hope that this will be a first step towards building a community of like-minded professionals in the field of South Asian education. And hopefully we will be able to create a network that will convene regularly to have meaningful dialogues and on the challenges posed by this pressing crisis. So thank you everyone for being part of this initiative. We are really looking forward to the presentations and discussions lined up over the next 2 days. Well, every day we have two roundtables followed by four panels, paper presentation panels in two rooms, room A and room B. You would have received the Zoom links to both these rooms. So now I would like to invite Professor Christopher Jerry, Deputy Head, Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, University of Oxford, to formally open this event. Over to you, Professor Jerry.
Thank you, Uma. Am I heard okay? Great. Good morning or afternoon, everybody, depending where you're tuning in from. My name is Christopher Gerry, and I'm the current Deputy Head and soon to become Head of OSGA, the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies here at the University of Oxford. It gives me enormous pleasure to offer an official welcome to you all to this virtual conference, convened as it is by OSGA's South Asian Studies Centre through its Education South Asia initiative. The conference, as you've just heard, addresses the issue of how we might need to rethink education in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the questions that recovery from the pandemic confronts us with. During today and tomorrow, the context for these discussions is the pandemic and post-pandemic setting of South Asia, which provides the lens through which the existing and new challenges and hopefully opportunities in education can be viewed. As Uma just explained, it's hoped that this event will provide for a first step toward building a community of academics, professionals, practitioners, and other stakeholders involved in the governance, design, delivery, and evaluation of education in South Asia, at a time when the resilience of public provision is tested to the extreme and the existing socioeconomic inequalities are likely to become further entrenched. 6 or 7 years ago, I attended a conference in St. Petersburg, Russia, which asked similar questions of education system resilience across the post-Soviet area in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2010. Reflecting on this and thinking about our presence within the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies reminds me of the additional opportunities that an area studies perspective can bring, not only in promoting dialogue and understanding that crosses disciplinary boundaries, but also through recognition of and engagement with the parallel experiences, debates and discussions that frame similar, though of course differing, challenges across the globe. Now, in your discussions today and tomorrow, you are already setting yourself challenges aplenty, so I'm loath to add to your list. But in establishing a new network of stakeholders, focusing on the challenges of strengthening education in South Asia, you might also reflect on how to exploit the opportunities that cross-regional as well as cross-disciplinary collaboration and comparison can offer. The globality of the current crisis surely offers up the possibility of enhancing global understanding and collaboration in addressing common challenges linked to the provision of public goods and the increasing problems that stem from social and economic inequalities. The next 2 days promise us to be both fascinating and important, and I personally look forward to dipping in and out as much as my schedule allows. On behalf of OSGA, and I think all of the participants, I'd like to congratulate and thank also the conveners, Uma Pradhan, Karen Valentin and Mohini Gupta, and their support team, Chase Podsakov, Devika and Shivani Mishra, for putting together such an impressive event, attracting, as you just heard, well over 800 registrations, and also providing a welcome reminder of the positive impact that contemporary systems of technology and communication, which bring us all together in virtual Oxford today, can offer us. Well, that's enough from me. I just want to finish by wishing you good luck with your discussions over the next 2 days. And I hope and believe that they represent the first steps to establishing an influential and enduring network of scholars, policymakers, and practitioners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's really wonderful to have your support. I would like now to move on to our first roundtable at the conference. The first roundtable is titled Rethinking Research in Education and looks at new areas of research, methodologies, and challenges that have opened up in the academia by the pandemic. While I would like to request the speakers and the chair for the first panelist to get ready, and while the first panel roundtable speakers are getting ready, can I request all our webinar attendees to spend a few minutes to fill out our pre-conference poll on your screen? I will enable the poll, and on your screen you will see a set of questions that might have popped up on your screen. There are a set of 5 questions and some options for you to choose. It will take only a few minutes, and it'll give us a sense of your expectations from the next 2 days and from where everybody's joining us today. Unfortunately, this can be filled in only by the attendees and not the panelists. So I'd like to request all the attendees to fill in this pre-conference poll while we are waiting for the first roundtable speakers. I'll keep it on for a minute or so. We're still getting responses, so I'll just wait for some time. And once the poll is completed, I will be able to share the results immediately after it's complete, and it'll show up on your screen. Yes, I think we have stopped getting the responses now. I will end the poll, and I should be able to share the results. Yes, that is the result of the poll. We seem to have it shows the background, organization, gender, country, and the expectations from this conference. I will stop sharing this poll now. Okay, so I think we can move on to the first roundtable. We are delighted to welcome our chair for this session and our co-convener of this conference, Karen Valentin, Associate Professor of Danish School of Education, Aarhus University. I'm handing over to Karen now to chair the conference and take this roundtable forward. We will take audience questions the final 30 minutes of this roundtable, so please feel free to send in your questions through the roundtable, through the Q&A function. And if you're watching this roundtable through the live stream on our YouTube channel, please do type your questions in the comment section, and we will take it from there. Thank you very much. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you very much, Uma. I just want to be sure all the panelists are here, because I don't see them on my screen, but I assume they are. Yeah, I'm pleased to welcome you all to this first session, Rethinking Research in Education, a roundtable discussion for which we have invited 5 distinguished scholars working on education across South Asia. These are Meenakshi Thapan, who's the director of Rishi Valley Education Center, India; Faisal Bari, Associate Professor of Economics and Education, LUMS, and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives, Pakistan; Manjula Vithanapathirana, Professor of Education Psychology, University of Colombo, Sri Lanka; Nitya Rao, Professor of Gender and Development, School of International Development, University of East Anglia; and Tejendra Pherali, Associate Professor in Education and International Development, University College London. We have asked the speakers to reflect on the following questions. What are the new areas of educational research that the pandemic has opened up for in the context of South Asia? And in the light of this question, what are the new analytical and methodological approaches to the study of education? Each speaker has got a maximum of 10 minutes to share her thoughts, which will be followed by a Q&A session, as Uma just said. So, to the audience, please share your questions in the Q&A window and not in the chat, please. We would also request you to formulate questions in a general way that can be responded to by several panelists, and thus not addressing specific panelists. In advance, I would also like to apologize that we'll probably not be able to bring all raised questions into this discussion, taking into consideration the vast number of attendees. So please keep all those in mind for following sessions over the next 2 days. Without further ado, I'll now give the word to Meenakshi Thapan. Here you go. And I will keep a watch, and I may interrupt after 9 minutes to make sure that we keep the schedule. Please.
Debate. Yeah, now can you hear me?
We
Yes?
can hear you. We can
Yes.
hear you. Thank you. We
Okay,
don't see you,
sorry.
but we can hear you.
Okay, great, because it was muted. I didn't quite remove the... Okay, so thanks so much to all of you for inviting me. As you know, I'm no longer a full-time academic. I have so actually crossed to the other side, so to speak, where I'm now a practitioner of education, engaged in both the work of our rural center, teacher training, as well as with the fee-paying school at Rishi Valley, which is in rural Andhra Pradesh in southern India. No doubt, education in South Asia has always been in crisis, and the pandemic has actually furthered the existing inequalities. We might say the cleavages, the dilemmas, and the anxieties around education. The effects are devastating, and I'm afraid many invisible outcomes still will remain unresolved unless we develop the skills, resources, and most importantly, the compassion to respond to them appropriately and urgently. And this is not a usual crisis that can be resolved through dialogue or crisis management. We need an uncommon approach, actually, to redress the imbalances created by the situation that we now find ourselves in. The structural consequences of the pandemic for education in a region like South Asia that has been torn by conflict, poor governance, and dwindling resources for a very long time, focus primarily on the increasing poverty as a result of the loss of livelihoods, the digital divide, and access to resources. The pandemic has affected the education of nearly 290 million children in India. 6 million children are already out of school, and we can add another million or more to that figure due to COVID. The girl child has faced particular difficulties. They are less likely to return to school at a later age. So with online education having taken over, our focus is primarily on what it means for children in India and South Asia. I won't spend much time on the digital divide in education. I'm sure my co-panelists would also like to comment on that. But I would like to mention just briefly that while 66% of India's population lives in villages, only a little over 15% of rural households have access to internet. And only 8% of all households, rural and urban, with members aged between 5 and 24, have both a computer and an internet connection. Among the poorest 20% households, only 2.7 have access to a computer and 8.9% to internet facilities. And of course, the situation varies from Bihar, where it's only 4.6% of the population in the age group has access to the computer and internet, to 35% in Delhi. Even in a state like Delhi, there is everybody does not have access. So apart from this digital divide created by this mode of delivery and its pedagogic consequences, a lack of access actually resulted in some students taking their lives due to the inability to participate. As we all read in the newspapers about a year ago, a young Dalit girl, a grade 9 student, died by suicide in Valentin in Kerala last year. Now, this was caused by the mental stress and anxiety that she was developing as a result of being unable to participate. I'd like to here briefly refer to the work of Veena Das, who reflects on the textures of the ordinary, wherein she focuses on the ordinary to understand that which eludes us in its very everydayness. She pays close attention to the diverse ways in which the natural and the social mutually absorb each other within overlapping forms of life. As researchers actually at this moment developing a sensitivity to the times we live in, I urge you to focus on the textures of the extraordinary, where the overwhelming difficulties of deprivation and poverty intersect with the loss of social and human interaction, where children have lost parents, siblings, grandparents to the pandemic, and have never experienced such loss in quick succession, where girls who had to fight very hard for their fundamental right to receive education in the first place, again find themselves fighting poverty, deteriorating mental health, lack of access to the required resources, and sexual discrimination at the same time. So this is trauma akin to war and conflict of the most devastating times that we live in. Foraging for food in a pandemic is not usual. Looking out for your loved ones in these times is always clouded by the fear of loss, of being rudderless. So we live in extraordinary times, and extraordinary times invite us to investigate the ordinary in unusual and surprising contexts. Let us focus on the human subject, on whose lived experience is of paramount importance. This is the texture of the extraordinary that is made up of emotion, extreme despair based on loss of livelihood, loss of social and human interaction, and trauma. I urge you, therefore, to consider the mental health consequences of the pandemic's impact on education as being one of the most significant fallouts of the pandemic. This in turn is linked to the lived experience of children and young adults who have faced 2 years of education of some kind online, for which neither they nor the hapless teachers forced into this online mode were adequately prepared. This has resulted in damage that will last a lifetime if it is not addressed on an urgent basis with health professionals, family, and teachers involved in restoring a healthy balance between providing knowledge and skills and emotional well-being. So do we know, for example, what has been the educational experience of mobile children during the pandemic? For example, of the Bakarwal and Gujjar communities in Kashmir? How have children who are differently abled fared during the pandemic? The hearing and speech impaired would have had a very different experience with online education. What is the experience of out-of-school girl children in states like Bihar and Rajasthan in India? Are they at work? Have they been sucked into child marriages? What are their educational aspirations post-pandemic? How have the demands for online education challenged our understanding of education as it's practiced in terms of curricula, pedagogy, social and human interaction? What happens to children who are deprived of contact with other children for long periods of time? And how can we challenge and change the imperatives that have been imposed on us by the pandemic? My primary concern really is with the understanding of the mental health of children, young adults at time. Do we as researchers pause to consider the experience of children whose parents have had to choose between life and loss of livelihoods? You know, the harrowing images of migrants walking back to their villages from big cities in India during lockdown will haunt us for a long time. Did we see the horror and helplessness in the eyes of children who were sitting atop their father's shoulders or being pulled by their hands, walking long distances to reach home? Do we understand the anxieties of children already disturbed by the violence in Kashmir, who now could no longer access the only friendly space they know, which is the local school? So social distancing in the pandemic has also resulted in new forms of othering, creating new predicaments for Dalits, for example. There is a rearticulation of the stigma through the pandemic language of social distancing. How has this played out in the lives of young Dalit children in the community? We rarely read an ethnography about the experience of Dalit children in school in pre-pandemic times. To foreground experience of Dalit children, is it possible to engage in such ethnographies, especially now when new forms of othering have taken over public spaces? I'd just like to end with some questions. Is it possible to reimagine research as it emanates from the extraordinary? It is indeed a challenge for changing our mode of inquiry in research and education, focusing not only on structural factors that no doubt restrict, deny, and provide a limited education, but also on the psychological factors that have shaped, distorted, and provided a very strange educational experience to children and young adults in the last 2 years. We urgently need to focus on understanding the trauma that children and the caregivers have experienced and develop the tools for this through both psychological and sociological lens. The sociological lens would unravel the specific socio-cultural context, whereas the psychological would enable us to understand the lived reality. For example, while caste results in or caste is related to inequality, why do we not listen to children's voices and understand the humiliation and suffering from their experience? We instead have to rely on Dalit autobiographies to enrich our understanding of caste. This, to my mind, is also the way we have shut ourselves to working in the field with children from marginalized communities, the Adivasis, refugees, and migrants. We need to have ethnographies of their lives in their interface with education, not merely read statistics about their exclusion. Subsequently, we must devise ways of providing a different experience to children in the classroom and outside as they navigate their way out of this mess. We need to urgently develop new modes of inquiry with relevant methodological tools that focus on the psychological well-being as children as much as on alleviating their physical trauma. This will ensure a citizenry that is not only technologically sound, but also recovered from the wounds of this pandemic. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you very much, Meenakshi. And I'll now give the word to Faisal Bari. Are you there?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, could we request all the roundtable speakers to switch on their video while making the presentation? Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in the roundtable. My comments are, it's interesting, roundtables are always interesting because in some ways, some of the material overlaps and is covered by other presenters. So I'll try to focus on areas that the previous presenter was is different from that. I think one of the first things that in terms of, so I'll divide my comments on two areas. One, new areas for research and thinking about education. And then our second part, I'll come to methods as well. In terms of new areas, one of the biggest things that other than the digital divide that was mentioned, and the digital divide is about not just about whether there is internet in a place or not, because there are some places in Pakistan where we don't have internet as yet. Whether the internet connection is stable enough or not. This becomes very important in synchronous versus asynchronous classes, etc. And then the speed of the internet, other than stability. And then devices. I mean, what sort of devices are available and to whom? Within the household. The other thing that came very, very strongly out of this year and a half of teaching and learning was the fact that home differences become very important when you are doing online teaching, whether children have a place to sit, whether they share devices with others. And there are very strong gender differentiated impacts. And there is research in Pakistan that shows that women in general, girls and women in general, bear the burden of household chores a lot more than boys and men. The care for the elderly, anyone falling sick, etc., was also shouldered disproportionately by women. Access to internet in many households for girls and women is more monitored. A lot of parents did not, as many non-parents also, did not know that internet would be and could be used for educational purposes. So monitoring children's access to internet was a big issue, and this would differentially impact girls as opposed to boys. whether you have space which is quiet, where you can open up your video, where you can open up your mic to participate in classes. That also is dependent on the kind of household you have, whether you have 5 siblings or 1, and you have space to sit or not. A lot of our, for example, I'm giving one example of this, and you can extrapolate to schooling also. Even at university level, a lot of our students who were on scholarships, etc., said that one of the reasons we were in hostels was because we did not have the kind of household environment where we could study. Now that you have pushed or sent us back to our household, how are you expecting us to study in, say, a 2-room house with 10, 15, or sometimes even 20 people sharing the space? And so what this brought out for me in terms of the kind of research that needs to be done is the impact of household environment, and in some ways also the importance that the physical space of a school or a university provides in trying to balance that that unevenness because of different households, and how that will impact. So it's not just about the pandemic. When it's not the fact that when schools open, this goes away. This is an important topic because we, and at least in Pakistan, there are 22 million children who were out of schools even prior to the pandemic. Now we expect the number to be 23 or 24 million. And the government and people keep thinking that online learning and teaching is the way forward to increase access and improve quality. If that's the way, that is indeed the case, then we have to think very deeply about household differences and how online teaching and learning can take into account household differences, and what does it mean for making the online teaching more effective. What are the kind of methods of participation or not, of learning or not? What are those methods that are more optimal for a differentiated receiver on the other end who might have different issues related to differences in households, as well as differences in the kind of devices and so on that they have. So it has an implication on the methods of teaching. It has the implications on the softwares we develop for teaching. It has implications on materials that we develop for such teaching. And all of those have to be reflected properly for age appropriate and sometimes other caveat appropriate, as I said, gender, but also maybe in terms of access, etc. Making that material, method, and systems more appropriate for that kind of individual that you are trying to face. I mean, one of the advantages we said, always felt of online teaching and learning is the level of customization that we can bring into the learning in some ways. But if that's true, then that needs to be explored a lot more. And it's not just a question of 50 children or 40 children joining a Zoom session and a teacher trying to teach on that Zoom session. So this entire area of methods, modes, material, and relating them to the level of the learner, whether in school or out of school, in universities or otherwise, I think provides a lot of opportunity for thinking about new research in terms of topics, etc. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of areas is, the previous speaker has already mentioned the mental impact, etc., are 2 more areas. One is learning losses, and those have been significant. I mean, most countries, Pakistan, I'll talk Pakistan, but many other countries also have chosen Pakistan chose to promote children from one grade to the next without final examinations last year in March or April. And this year, the government is insisting that they will have exams, even though the schools were closed for most of the year. And there has been a tremendous battle of students versus government on whether there should be exams or not. Now, that almost a year and a half of learning has been tremendously disrupted, but differentially disrupted. So elite schools were able to go to online teaching and learning and various methods very early on, whereas obviously for government schools and a lot of children from more constrained socioeconomic circumstances were not able to do that. But now examinations are being held for everyone. And well, what kind of differential impact would that have? That's one side. But the other side is that the learning losses that have happened what are the kind of remedial or other programs that could be put in place to recoup them, and then to make sure that children are able to move forward better than before, or at least where they were prior to the pandemic. So I think that entire area of learning losses and how to move forward is important. I think this, in some ways, it gives us this sort of shock allows us to rethink a lot of things. So there are opportunities here as well, because everyone was forced to go online. Before last March, other than in occasional Skype, I had never actually interacted as much through online frameworks. Suddenly I was learning Zoom and Teams and I don't know what else, and learning management systems and so on. And there, even within our school, our university, we did a lot of innovations that were driving then, because of necessity to do it, driving various kinds of things. Now, how far can this medium of online learning be pushed? I think that requires a lot of work and a lot of thinking and some research to figure out where we can go with that, with the innovations. In terms of methods of research, so a lot of our fieldwork stopped. We had to move to phone surveys. We have to do all sorts of things which raised very serious and still some problems that we haven't solved as yet. It raised ethical issues about whether phone interviews are to be recorded or not, what to do with them. It raised issues about how do you find the universe that you want to go to, because mobile phones are not with everyone. It raised issues of how do you draw samples on mobile phones and so on, and ethical issues of what data can you use or cannot use, what you can get from mobile companies or other sources. So a lot of methodologically, we had to figure out new things to do when we were moving from, because we couldn't go into the field, we couldn't be face to face with many of our respondents and so on. And that has also happened in some of the other areas that we've been doing. So that has raised very interesting methodological problems of, how do you do RCTs or not? How do you do surveys? And qualitative versus quant as well. Phone interviews are difficult. You get more restricted. And also there are certain kinds of questions that are more difficult to ask when you're not face to face and so on. And when you can't really record the facial expressions properly, etc. So methodologically also plenty of challenges which we're still looking at, and also the topics that I've talked about. Thank you very much. I think that's 10 minutes.
That was perfect. Thank you very much. So we'll go to the third presenter, Manjula Vithanapathirana. So are you there? Yeah, welcome.
I think the previous two speakers have, I have kind of, very common issues to share with them. So anyway, my presentation is also divided into two, about issues and the methodologies. And I'll focus on Sri Lanka because, Sri Lanka has had a very high kind of a standard in South Asia for many decades in general education. And because of the pre-education policy and network of schools around the island providing access to education for all, the pandemic has collapsed the system of face-to-face modality of the general and higher education systems, which was the predominant delivery mode in education in Sri Lanka. So with the rising waves, we are still closed and we are thinking, what is post-pandemic? Unknown, yet unknown. And how will our education systems function? And post-pandemic will be filled with high degree of uncertainty. So I thought to take decisions on post-pandemic, we need to reflect on the lessons learned from both pre-pandemic and during pandemic. What were our mistakes? What were the effective survival strategies? What changes are needed in our policies and practices to ensure the goals of SDGs? I'm not going to highlight the digital divide. My previous co-presenters have given the scenarios in Pakistan and India. And we too have these connectivity issues, high data costs, family issues with several children and parents going online. So this is one of the popular, photographs in a newspaper where, children nowadays, looking for connectivity in high mountains, top of trees, and, in various places. And so the disparities in the quality of educational environments got exacerbated due to pandemic. So we had anyway issues of disparity. So popular schools and small schools. So popular larger schools, they continued with online, but the smaller underprivileged schools are unable to continue their education, and they are the most vulnerable due to lack of facilities, resources. And those people who are living in remote localities, our country is small, but even though the country is small, internet access is sparse in various regions. So public examinations, as my as the previous presenter informed, they are getting scheduled, and no one knows how these children are getting prepared. So I feel that reconceptualizing issues and strategies of education for all as the main issue of education in the post-pandemic is the most important thing. And again, it was earlier highlighted about the methodologies of teaching, because we never thought of, training our teachers for online teaching. We never did. We just started with the EU-funded Erasmus Plus project. We started planning one just before the pandemic, but we have not finished about doing it. And so ways to train teachers remotely for online teaching would be really welcome. And the curricula. So we have learned lessons from disasters across the world, including this pandemic. It's obvious that emphasis of curricula should be on environment during the post-pandemic. If not, the human race will be wiped out of this planet very soon. Hence, we need to focus on research on innovative approaches to build in environmental conservation and protection within all curricula. And we have seen the bitter realities. The first presenter was, highlighting the bitter realities of these life-threatening effects of the pandemic. So, but we have to think the life has to be cherished. At least during the post-pandemic, we need to cultivate social harmony within and across nations to uplift the human quality to make this world a better place to live. We should not repeat mistakes of human destruction. An international research agenda to develop strategies towards this need should be drawn. Again, building resilience and self-regulation, social isolation, distancing have exacerbated the mental health concerns. So in Sri Lanka, what we have been trying to do to launch some interventions such as mindfulness training, it has to be researched, of course. Children are missing their childhood, spending time with depressed adults experiencing the pandemic. What would be the impact of such? It's a question that needs addressing urgently. COVID-19 pandemic may not be the final episode of pandemics or any other disasters. It is better to empower all with life skills, such as building resilience in the communities, which should be placed as a priority. Education can play a larger role in this endeavor. Regarding methodology, research should be need-based, constructivist, and pragmatic, not limiting to fact-finding. Short-term, quick response research designs should also be adopted. Research with the perspective of developing interventions would be needed for the development of a range of models from ACCE to higher education, with some emphasis on online delivery and blended learning maybe. It would be better to adopt emergent designs for research to study the unfamiliarity of the impact of the pandemic. It is not possible for us to plan our research and launch it, before we get onto the needs of people, the disaster, and the sagas of the communities. So emergent designs are recommended in contrast to structured approaches. The emergent designs welcome the unanticipated information, often adding to the richness of the data, which would allow for innovation. And successful practices addressing educational interventions during the pandemic should be encouraged for publication through non-fee-loving open access practice-oriented journals to enable the Asian practitioners in education to disseminate their research based on practices. Analytically mixed methodological perspective will be more advantageous to make conclusions leading to pragmatic recommendations. And cross-cultural research, if can be promoted, would lead to mixing of perspectives towards better research outcomes. So this is what I want to say. We are sharing a lot of, similar stories. So I'm very glad that we are here today, discussing together and planning to work together. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that. And our fourth speaker is Nitya Rao. We just need the, you're still sharing the screen. Yeah, perfect. Nitya Rao, I'll give the word to you.
Thanks very much. Just looking for my, sorry. Can you see my screen, Karen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So good morning, good afternoon to all of you. And thank you very much, Karen and Uma, for inviting me to share a few insights on this panel on rethinking research in education. I'm going to share a few insights actually, which have some overlaps with the previous speakers, but are really linked to my areas of research interest in education, which has focused on adults and youth in particular. So in my earlier research, I have focused on adult literacy and adult learning, using a lot of participatory action research methods, and also working with youth, particularly post-secondary or secondary school youth, both boys and girls who are transitioning into work situations, looking at aspects of skills and so on, which is very much neglected within, it is still sort of an underrepresented area within educational research. The primary focus, of course, being on schools and on children in schools, rightly so. So I think before going on to what are the new areas and the methodological approaches, I just want to share my own positionality in the past 20, 25 years of educational research, which has mainly been participatory and ethnographic. It has built on sort of Freirean ideas and also feminist ideas based on principles of reciprocity, valuing diverse voices, co-production of knowledge, empowerment, and so on. And of course, this has made it a real challenge now in the pandemic context, because clearly there are difficulties of travel, there are difficulties of face-to-face engagement. So how are we really going to pursue or carry forward participatory approaches with people with whom I've been working? So the thing to say also, I think this is a point that Meenakshi mentioned. I think in my own research practice, I have worked, being an anthropologist and ethnographer, I have worked with few very marginalized indigenous or Adivasi communities in India, particularly in Eastern India. It was earlier when I started working in the early 90s. The Santhal Parganas was a part of Bihar state. In 2000, it was made into a separate state of Jharkhand. So that's roughly the location where I have been working. So the pandemic has really thrown a lot of questions in terms of, both the areas of research, and also I think very importantly for me, what are the methods and approaches, because it's a really questioning of one's, not just methods, but I think also analytical approach and epistemology, or the approach to knowledge. If you've been dealing with sort of participatory approaches for the last 25 years, how do you engage in this new context? And how do you actually come to terms epistemologically with this? So I will give a few examples of the last 2 years, what I have been trying to do, especially with one of my research projects. And also I had a research project and a research translation award, which was focused on the theme of sustainable food systems. But we were really trying to learn about people's indigenous knowledges around food systems, what are the ways of engagement and translation into practice, how is it kind of looked at, or how is it dealt with, for instance, within school curriculum? How do they talk about food or forests or farming practices or nutrition or a balanced diet, particularly vis-a-vis these indigenous communities? So I think drawing on sort of a broad sense of a citizen science where remote working had become essential, but how do you work remotely? And I think we decided over the past year and a half in my current research, and this is with Santhal communities, as I said, in Eastern India and Bihar and Jharkhand, that we've drawn on principles of citizen science, working with youth, young people, both young men and women, as collaborators in research. So as research collaborators. However, citizen science often tends to look at these people as individuals, and coming from a more participatory feminist lens, I think we didn't want to let go of the collective consciousness or the collective part of the research process itself, that it's not just a question of individual, but it's also a question of collective interface. So women's groups were also a part of this process. And I just want to quickly share some insights and some questions that have emerged from 3 practices which we have tried. One has been participatory filmmaking with these indigenous youth. Second is a community-led digital platform. I think since we've been talking about the digital divide, I just wanted to spend a minute or two on that. And then how do we mainstream, or how do we actually use some of these insights coming from the community level to interface with higher education system? How do we legitimize some of this information or some of this knowledge that is being generated? Really, if I'm talking about these people as researchers, as collaborators, how do we also legitimize their knowledge within mainstream higher education institutions? And that is my third point, really, where we're trying to work with the Open University to co-develop some curriculum, which is an open access course. So just very quickly on this participatory filmmaking, this was part of my project. So a colleague of mine from the University of East Anglia from Film Studies, who's a filmmaker and a reader in the Department of Film Studies, went out to India just before the pandemic last March, and she trained these youth groups in terms of use of a camera, in terms of editing films, how do you take footage, how do you look at light, sound, narrative, and so on. So this was very interesting. She'd done a workshop already with them, and then she left this sort of very good professional camera, which was part of the project again with the group. Soon after she left, in mid-March, the pandemic, the lockdown was announced in India. It was a national lockdown on March 24th, and we no longer could have the scope to actually go to these communities or work with these youth. What they ended up doing was just making film. So over the 6 months of lockdown and so on, these young people, girls and boys, ended up making about 30, 40, 50 films, which they then put on a YouTube channel. They also did community level screenings of these films, and then discussing and getting feedback from whoever in the community, from children, from youth, from women, and so on. So there were certain issues. We also watched these films. And of course, this was completely done by themselves. And so in terms of the educational process or the research process, how did we set up then the process of feedback and discussion of what they were doing, even in terms of filmmaking, that whom were they trying to communicate with, who was their audience, what were they communicating, and so on. They knew that our project was on food systems, so a lot of these films are on food. But then since they had also learned subtitling, they were getting, these young people were finding information from the net and putting it there in text. Now, the feedback that they got from the communities in general was very good, partly because these were films made by the local people and everybody was very happy to see themselves on the films. And now thinking about, we, however, found that there were issues in terms of, for instance, the subtitling, that using subtitles rather than voice narratives, because there's a gender issue here that a lot of the women really don't know the main language of Hindi, but they speak in their own language, Santhali. So giving subtitles in Hindi in a way would exclude those viewers from learning from this process. So of course, now we are thinking about what kind of analysis, what do we learn from this? What kind of analysis has this process brought to us? How can the feedback coming both from the youth, as well as a quote here from a young woman who was a participant and who's made some of these films, she talking about her grandmother saying that she's so happy that they've captured some of their indigenous knowledge, but also these youth are very much, they feel that their skills have been validated. Adivasis in India are often seen as very backward, even if they're educated, and they're only seen as laboring classes. So for them to be seen as filmmakers, as skilled, is something that has really improved their sense of themselves. And the third is, of course, about also these intergenerational conversations. So now we are going into a process really of how do we analyze the content of these films, plus the process of these films, taking feedback from the youth themselves, but also from their communities. So this has been one initiative. We're still in the process, so I don't know what the outcomes will be. A second is using the mobile phone. Since this was spoken about, I'll just talk about this very briefly, actually, but it's quite interesting, again, for us from a learning perspective. It has raised some issues because we thought we had just introduced this mobile as a two-way. It was a simple mobile, not an app, a voice system where there are certain content that is developed and the community can respond and add to the content. We trained, again, these local groups and youth as moderators, so they could themselves upload responses and so on, and a range of formats. Now here we have really come up with an issue because of the lockdown and so on, that while people have used this medium for many different purposes, including somebody Meenakshi mentioned the migrant crisis. So actually this medium was used by many of the migrants from this location in Jharkhand who were stuck in other states of India to seek help. And as we were working through an NGO, we actually got them help. But from an educational perspective, it has really raised the issue of language and the importance of language. Because a lot of the content that we had been developing was in Hindi, which is the main language. And as to school, understand Hindi, a lot of the girls and a lot of the women who dropped out of school don't really quickly or equally fast. So while we have a research component built into this as a pre and post survey within the implementation process, I think there are problems with this survey because of the language issue. It is running in both Hindi and Santhali. More of the responses are in Santhali, but less of responses from our side or content is in Santhali. So I think this also raises to me a very important issue, that is of face-to-face. These are children from the local community. And as Meenakshi already mentioned, and others before me, that schools have been closed for a long period of time. These children are already disadvantaged. And what some of the youth have been started doing is to record the lessons from the textbook on these mobile phones, and including with translation in their own language. And these young kids of 8 to 10 years are really listening, shared devices, simple mobile phones. They are listening to them and asking questions to the people who are actually recording. I mean, this is, again, I think, a very important issue in terms of language within educational research, which has been thrown up by the pandemic. Because even if these children were in class, there is a question really about how much they learn, given that there are two languages. One is their mother tongue, and they're being taught in a language which is alien to them. And the final thing, which is my last slide, I just wanted to conclude with, is that we are now trying to use all this research and knowledge, including all these YouTube videos, the participant content, to develop a 4-credit MOOC for the Indira Gandhi National Open University, which will be hosted on the Government of India's free online platform called Swayam, which is open to everybody. And the course is called Creative Communication Extension and Community Resource Management for Sustainable Development. But I think it's quite interesting because, again, I think when it comes to developing the course, we are trying to be as fair as possible to local perspectives and to indigenous knowledges. However, because of the restrictions of higher education institutions, at the end of the day, it is people like me who are actually recording these lessons or are doing the videos for this online MOOC. It's not these community volunteers themselves who are recording the lessons, because as per the terms of IGNOU, the first course or the course has to be launched in English, and then it can be translated into local languages. So I think the issue of inequality in education across several levels is one of the main issues that I feel that the last 2 years of the pandemic has really opened up for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And then we will move to the fifth and final presenter. And I would also encourage the participants to start formulating their questions and pose them in the question or in the Q&A window so that we can go on with that afterwards. But first, you, Tejendra, Pherali, the word is yours.
Thank you, Karen. Let me share my screen if I can. Okay, can you see my screen?
We see it, yes, please.
Yeah, okay, so thank you. Yeah, thanks, Uma and Karen and colleagues for inviting me to this very interesting conference. So I'm particularly interested in educational research from a conflict perspective. So for me, the key questions are concerned with how education contributes to production of social, political, and economic inequalities that create or fuel conditions for political tensions and violent conflicts in many circumstances. And what kind of educational processes relating to policy formulations, curricula, pedagogies, and distribution of educational resources are likely to nurture positive human relationships and peace with social justice. So in the post-COVID-19 times, as we heard earlier from speakers on this panel, how educational access and quality of learning has been disproportionately impacted across various groups, and how the gains around girls' education, enrollments of children from poor and marginalized communities, and the progress made around school governance are at stake and are likely to have long-term impact in hardening inequalities and social injustices. So my presentation doesn't specifically analyze the impact of COVID-19, but I would attempt to provide a conceptual or analytical framework of education and conflict, which could be actually drawn upon to look into the impact of COVID-19 on education, which is a more kind of a compounded crisis, combining with other types of existing problems that communities have been experiencing, and the COVID-19 has exacerbated those conditions. Education, as sociologist Michael Appel argues, is a political act. Most of the educational research in low and conflict-affected contexts is dominated by excessive educationism. The focus is on the technical challenges, such as the lack of school buildings, textbooks, trained teachers, and institutional capacities, which are undoubtedly crucial, but more attention, I think, is needed on the issues of broader sort of security and political economy factors involving the distribution of power and wealth between different groups and individuals, and the processes that create, sustain, and transform these relationships over time. So I have kind of proposed a theoretical framework for analysis that can potentially help us better understand the intersections between education, conflict, and peace. And I loosely call this the VPLP framework. The first analytical lens could be to look at education as a victim of conflict and crisis. In conflict-affected contexts, education is often targeted for violent attack as it gives, as it serves as a propaganda tool for rebels, and state forces also repress educational institutions, teachers and students when they resist the state authority. When people flee their homes because of violence, children's normal educational routines are disrupted. And conflict-affected populations face enormous social, economic, and psychological difficulties. COVID-19 has disrupted education worldwide, but the learning opportunities of the most vulnerable populations, such as ethnic minorities, internally displaced people, rural populations, and urban poor, have been disproportionately affected. A recent UNESCO report highlights that millions of students are at risk of not returning to education, many of them eventually dropping out completely. COVID-19 has exacerbated the already poor conditions of education provisions in conflict-affected contexts. The lockdown measures have decimated informal economies on which internal migrants, refugees, and internally displaced populations rely on. For the urban poor, slum dwellers, and refugees in overcrowded camps, social distancing, working from home, and online education are impossible luxuries. Secondly, education can be examined as a perpetrator of conflict and violence. Education that produces structural inequalities, social divisions, and discriminations against ethnic and religious minorities is complicit in fueling conditions of conflict. There are widespread examples from around the world where formal education has been complicit in fueling grievances among the marginalized groups. The dominance of high hill caste and their ethnic language on ethnic minorities in Nepal, depiction of Tamils as the historical other in Sinhalese textbooks in Sri Lanka, the ethnicity-based quota system to exclude Tutsi children in education in Rwanda, Burmanization of education in Myanmar, and misrepresentation of the World War II atrocities caused by Japanese troops in China and Korea all exemplify the conflict-inducing role of education. So education can be complicit in producing virulent and exclusionary nationalism that, I quote UNESCO, inspires devotion to one's community or love of country. For others, it is linked to feelings of fear, anger, revenge, and resentment. In conflict-affected contexts, as Ben Parath argues, citizen identities are recreated as belligerent citizens, as a response to perceived threats to national and personal security. Here, the notion of democratic citizenship is reinterpreted as the nature of civic participation during periods of conflict and emergencies, such as in this pandemic, is securitized and shifted from open and voluntary civic engagement to directed and mandated participation in which citizens are expected to be compliant and contributing to the war or security measures. Educational systems that are insensitive to social inequalities often play a socially destructive role by maintaining unequal access and quality to education among different social groups, offering a segregated and unjust educational provision, manipulating history and textbooks, denying education to certain social and ethnic groups, and representing repressing minority languages and cultures. For example, looking at the case of India and Pakistan, my colleague Marie Lal shows how educational resources, including textbooks, often glorify military victories and engage in collective demonization of their opponents, which serves as a political machine to manufacture ideological consent in favor of the state. Thirdly, education can be viewed through the lens of liberation, whereby the goal is for teaching and learning to promote emancipation from oppressive societal structures through transformation towards social justice and democracy. At the heart of this educational current is the field of critical pedagogy, as Nitya was also discussing earlier on her research, is by the Brazilian philosopher and educator Paulo Freire. In his seminal work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the Freirean philosophy believes in the awakening of the critical consciousness through critical reflection of everyday power structures. Beyond deeper understanding of one's personal circumstances, an important aspect of conscientization is praxis, action-based change, which challenges oppressive power structures. Finally, education for peace building is characterized by an action-oriented, multidisciplinary learning process that goes beyond the knowledge-based classroom activity about peace. The aim of such an education is to build capacities in learning to interpret what the peace theorist Johan Galtung would call the continuum of violence: symbolic, structural, and physical. In this sense, the curriculum for peace building demands critical classroom-based interactions with practical activities that relate to social, cultural, and political issues that are based in the local communities. Bush and Saltarelli, in their work, argue that peace-building education should involve, and I quote, a bottom-up rather than top-down process driven by war-torn communities themselves, founded on their experiences and capacities, firmly rooted in immediate realities, not in abstract ideas or theories, end of quote. So educational policies that promote equitable access to education can benefit socioeconomically disadvantaged populations, through which potential ethnic tensions can be minimized. Schools can, for example, promote instruction in the mother tongue of the region, especially in early years, rather than imposing a dominant national language on minority groups. So just to conclude, finally, the COVID-19 pandemic has created compound crises in education in conflict-affected settings. Global responses to educational disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic have been inadequate to mitigate these compound crises. There has also been a rise of authoritarianism and ultranationalism in several parts of the world, and South Asia is no exception. There are nevertheless new social movements led by marginalized social groups across the region. Farmers' protest in India, civil disobedience movement in Myanmar, and ethnic and indigenous people's struggles in Nepal are some of these examples. These grassroots movements and their learning processes provide new opportunities for research and knowledge production. We live in an uncertain world, but as Francis Varus points out, uncertainty is generative rather than unproductive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tejendra, and thanks to all 5 presenters. These are enormously interesting and important presentations. I think you have arranged a number of issues, which I'm positive that we will continue with in the sessions to come. We'll now open for the Q&A session, but I think first, I would also request you, as I said before, to make your questions, if possible, to make them so general so that all presenters or some presenters can respond to them. But I think no matter what these 5 presentations have also shown is that pedagogy is, as so many educational thinkers have also claimed, is certainly not just a theoretical exercise, but needs to be normative in the sense of action-oriented. And I think the current situation calls for that more than ever. I would also like, as an initial question, like to ask the panelists if you could reflect briefly, at least some of you, on what are the scopes for collaborative research on this? Because, we also in this room or screen, whatever we call it, several people who are not from South Asia ourselves, but who have been engaged in research for many years in South Asia. And I think given the different positionalities that Nitya also talked about, how can we actually kind of enhance or do the best kind of collaborative research under these conditions? And also in the light of the global inequalities have just rendered more visible than ever for a long time. So I wonder if any of you would have some comments on that. And then afterwards, I'll go to the Q&A. So any of you would like to answer or share your reflections on that? The scopes for collaborative research also. Nitya, you appeared on the screen. Would you? And I saw there was a short, and afterwards I saw your hand, Faisal.
Maybe Faisal can go first. He had his hand up.
Yeah.
So, and then I have a couple of other questions, so maybe I can come back to this one as well.
Perfect. Faisal?
Thank you, Karen. I think the number of things that are important at this stage, as you saw from the presentations also, the number of questions that are very large. And I don't think, at least I can speak for Pakistan, I don't think we have the depth and breadth in our research community to really explore all of these, or even a majority of them on our own. Our research community is still not very large, is still struggling with a number of other things, etc. So one advantage of collaboration is, of course, increase in numbers and ability to reflect on others, etc., who might be in either other, say, South Asian countries or working from Western countries, but on issues of South Asia. So that's definitely possible, and it will help a lot in broadening and deepening the work that we do in any country, including Pakistan. The second thing is, it would be lovely to have, and this is one of the aims of the conference also, I guess, is lovely to think through how do you take lessons from such research and disseminate it and share it across the countries as well. Because I think a number of challenges that have been mentioned from various country perspectives are very similar, if not the same, and will have lessons for each other. What is the forum? What is the way? Is it a journal? Is it bringing it together in some journals, or creating some other way of sharing, which might be important as well? I also think that it's finally, in terms of research, my feeling is that larger projects always give you the ability. So by larger, I mean not just in terms of doing it across countries, but also over time as well. So, and that ability requires a lot more collaboration to bring together larger groups that are able to do it and sustain some work for 2-3 years or longer, 4 years, etc. And I think the lessons from that kind of work would also be very useful. So those 2-3 things I definitely see a lot of potential for, because I don't think the pandemic is going to go away very soon, but more importantly, I don't think the impact of the pandemic is going to go away very soon, and this is going to stay with us. And the way some of the climate change and other things are going, especially some of the South Asian countries are very vulnerable, and so having the right research and preparing for things will be very important for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think Nitya would make a comment to that, and then Meenakshi, and then after that I'll have Usha Jha from who will give a comment as well. So.
Thanks, Karen. I think collaboration is very important. I think your question is absolutely valid, and I think during the times of pandemic, collaborative work is the only way forward. I think as academics, we often think only of collaboration with other academics, but also often not in these marginalized locations. So whether it's in Nepal, they may be in Kathmandu, in India, they may be in Delhi, or big cities. So I think we need to rethink in that sense our collaborations and partnerships as well. And how do we also move beyond sort of academic collaborators to also other kinds of institutions as collaborators. So it could be people's organizations, it could be social movements, it could be NGOs, and so on. So I think for me that has been very important. in terms of collaboration. And I think it remains, I mean, we couldn't have even started to do some of this work, which we've been trying. I don't know the results over the last 2 years, if it hadn't been for some of the very strong collaborations, both with the local community organization, as well as the NGO Pradhan, who's been mediating this process. I just wanted to link this up with some of the questions. There was a question from Rohini Sen, actually a couple of questions about the institutional constraints in co-production legitimizing of indigenous knowledge. I think, yes, institutional constraints in academia is one thing, but I think Rohini, actually, especially being in a UK, I think there are also differences where you are in academia. So at the moment, being in UK academia is a slight advantage over being in Indian higher education, which has come under a lot of attack from the state whenever they have spoken up in favor of the voices, particularly of the Adivasis and the Dalits. So any academics who have spoken up have also come under threat, as have human rights activists and others. We know this from the news media as well. But I think interestingly in UK academics, especially if it is in development studies or if it's linked to research projects, I think UK research councils, they may or may not be sort of consciously thinking about the politics of knowledge or the politics of this. However, they do emphasize on research impact and on working with communities on issues of inequality and on equitable partnerships and so on. So actually there is scope even within the academia to actually operationalize some of these words like equitable partnerships or and so on, or collaboration in the way one interprets them from one's own political standpoint. The other issue, I think, which is a real constraint is the hegemony of language, which you have asked about, the hegemony of language, knowledge, and conventional outputs in academia. And this is everywhere. I think in English, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in India, I think I have had a long battle over the last 1 year with the Indira Gandhi National Open University, which is the largest open university in the world, which has millions of students enrolled from all group categories, that we should launch this MOOC in Hindi, which is more accessible to a larger number of people than English. However, as per their norms, it has to start off with English, even though it's a free open access course. But we kind of worked with them to say that, okay, if you're going to do it in English, but simultaneously we are going to work on translating it at least into Hindi and then put into the agreement that other Indian languages, because this course is really targeting youth. I said that my interest is very much in building skills of youth, women's groups, and so on in rural areas. And the pandemic has also affected them in terms of the kind of an interface we can have. So I want this course to be accessible to some of those. But I know the Santhal youth whom I showed you on the pictures, they will not be able to make much sense of the MOOC in English as we are presenting it now, unless it is at least in Hindi. And for the children, of course, and women, even Hindi is not sufficient. It has to be in Santhali. So there is a battle still in terms of the hegemony of language. The other point in terms of hegemony of knowledge, and I think that's slightly different from language, and that was also linked to another question about the process of curriculum development, which another anonymous, it came up as anonymous on the screen question, that how do we validate these knowledges of the indigenous people, communities, and so on. And I think here it's quite interesting when we talk about co-production of knowledge. So some of what I described was that we left it to them. I mean, we had been working with them for 6 months prior to the lockdown, fortunately. So they knew what this thing was, our project was about. The theme is food, and food is a universal theme. So even for these children, it was about their forests, it was about plants, it was about their farms and cultivation. It was about what they eat. And I'll just give you one very small example. So when they did all these recordings of films, they have made films about ants or red ants, which they cook into a gravy or a chutney. The children actually made a film, which has been, I can share the link later on. It is part of the UN Food System Summit Youth Challenge, actually. It got picked up called Bamar Pitha. Bamar is a field mouse. So they made a film about how children of 10 to 11 to 12 age group hunt these little mice in the field and then cook it there. And they see that it's a very strong source of protein, for instance. Now, this is really a clash or a question of indigenous knowledge. Now, are we going to accept that this field mouse with these children pick up and cook is a good source of protein? So I was working with some nutritionists to say, okay, we would like to validate in terms of nutritive knowledge that we can give back to them. Okay, if you consume this much of rat, fine, you can't afford dal, which is costing 100 rupees a kilo in the market. But if you eat how much of this? And then the nutritionist came back to me to say that in all the global data sets on nutritive values and nutritics, there is no nutritive value for this field mouse. So I think this is where we encounter this kind of inequalities in knowledges. So how do I legitimize as science or as research this kind of recipe or this kind of film that these children and youth have produced about this? And they claim that it gives us strength, it's a very good source of protein and so on. But in the modern scientific world, I don't have a device to legitimate that. So this is going to continue. I think your point is absolutely right, that tackling this hegemony. But I think also for me in my personal practice, being having worked in the women's movement before I came into academia, I think, and being, you know, not necessarily like going to the streets and protesting, but also in my thinking and ideology and epistemology, I think this is a struggle that needs to carry on, that we need to keep challenging some of these. It may not happen right now. It may happen 5 years later, 10 years later, I don't know. We are planning to use some of this material already on our online course with links and as part of the MOOC and as supplementary material and so on. So unless and until somebody objects to that, I would like to place it in the public domain already with this course. Your third point was around demystifying expertise.
Maybe Nitya, if you can make it a bit brief, because there's several other people who want to.
So I will just stop with that, and then maybe I can come back to this later.
Okay, Meenakshi, you had a comment?
Yeah, I would like to just say a few things. We had started actually a collaborative collective. Can you hear me?
It just fell out, but now I could hear you again. Please go on.
Yeah. So we had organized the first South Asian Conference on Education at the University of Delhi in 2000. And we had formed a collective on South Asian scholars, all working in the field of education. Unfortunately, it didn't go very far. But I'm beginning to think today, listening to all the speakers and the kind of range of expertise and the kind of work that each person has been doing, that perhaps we need to now think of such a collective again of younger scholars as well, who could actually contribute to developing a perspective which comes from South Asia. That's one aspect of collaboration that I would like to suggest. And I do agree with Nitya that perhaps we don't focus only on academia, but local community organizations, which I have found very enriching for my own work, as well as with NGOs, women's groups, and maybe working on something else, not directly on education, but it feeds in. Because there are aspects of life in the community, all of which come together. It's again like a tapestry, right? It comes together and works with, helps us understand education at the local level.
I think you fell out now, at least on my.
Can you?
It's falling out now. Okay, until you reappear, Meenakshi, then I'll just, Tejendra, was your comment also on the collaborative?
I just wanted to, reflect a little bit on this idea of collaboration. And I think collaboration has become...
Finish one second.
Came back.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's the last point before I forget. I think I would like to suggest, and I know this is often not possible when one is in the thick of academia, but sometimes it's important for us all as academics to actually step back a little from the theoretical, our concern with conceptual and theoretical categories, with sophistication of different kind, perspectives, projections, and engage much more with people, with the community, with the local, at the local level, to understand what's really happening on the ground. I think we need a kind of a commitment to that. We can, of course, continue to do our work with the kind of perspectives that we seek to build or rebuild and so on. But it is nice to also be committed to what's happening on the ground, to understand really the different aspects of education and the impact of the pandemic. So perhaps we could think of a collective taking and some other points, I'm sure others. Sorry, Tejendra. Yeah, please go ahead.
That's all right. Thank you.
Back to you.
Yeah, very briefly. So the 2 points really. So I think collaboration has become a kind of a buzzword particularly in education and international development, which I work on. And I think the problem is the power relationship that operates in these collaborations, whose voice is heard and recognized and prioritized, and whose voice doesn't count. So just having those very superficial collaborative arrangements don't necessarily produce really horizontal partnership outcomes. I think that's very important. I think the response to COVID-19 has also been very much top-down, and a lot of educational responses are coming from the specialists who have never lived in these very difficult rural areas, and don't necessarily always know the contexts, and the national governments tend to kind of follow those global directives and push forward with these ideas. I mean, online education is a classic example, and we discussed earlier, and various panelists mentioned about the lack of access. Meenakshi, you mentioned about the access to the internet connectivity and problems, and Faisal talked about the stability of the connectivity and so forth. But we really have this opportunity to learn from some of the very local initiatives which are emerging as a response to the COVID-19 and its impact on education. For example, an inclusive education research that I'm working on at the moment in Nepal, teachers and community participants were suggesting that the higher education students who have been sent back to their villages from universities are increasingly taking up the roles as teachers for their younger siblings and their wider family members. And that's quite nice. Faisal talked about higher education students complaining about not having the space to actually study for themselves, but they can, take this opportunity to become mentors and teachers for their younger siblings who can't actually go to schools. Teachers also are forming small groups of children in little township and traveling from one village to another to teach smaller group of children in villages, rather than all children coming to school, which creates a problem for social distancing. So those small groups are being created, and teachers are going around to meet, maintaining social distancing with these children, and then teach subjects. Like 1 week you have a maths teacher, another week you've got a science teacher, and that way. So this is a very interesting initiative which is coming from the village. The other thing one of my head teachers was telling me is that the government is asking us to teach using television and radio. That we know that it's so difficult for children, even in the classroom with some of the resources, to engage in learning, and then learning outcomes are really low in some of these low resourced areas. And thinking that television and radio based teaching is going to solve the problem during the pandemic, it's not possible, and there's a lack of evaluation of these initiatives. So we need to be very careful about really celebrating these grand initiatives which talk about, radio, TV, but actually what's happening in terms of quality of learning, that's key, and we don't have the evidence around that. And finally, I think schools were actually coming together to sit on the playgrounds when the weather is nice and is not disruptive, maintaining social distancing, and teachers were actually teaching under the tree or on the ground rather than teaching in the classrooms, because there's no access to the internet, and as we know, the problems of digital technologies among rural populations. So we really need to think about what is happening, and we need to bring that to fore and learn from those very much endogenous initiatives that communities are leading as a response to this crisis.
Thank you for all the responses. I'll just give the word to Usha Jha, who is the former member of the National Planning Commission from Nepal. Usha was supposed to take part in the second roundtable discussion this afternoon, but unfortunately is not available to make it. So just a few minutes from you, Usha, to join in the conversation here, please.
Thank you so much, Karen, for considering me. And I'm really very happy to be the part of this session, though research and development and this policy. We can't separate it. I'm happy to link my few comments with Tejendra, because he has already introduced Nepal over here. And there are so much innovations. I was actually very much involved during this COVID crisis. And I was the one who was looking at the education section. So it was like whole education we can't just isolate and then develop a policy to handle the situation. This has become a multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder state. We need wash over there in school. We need agriculture, food security. It's equally needed. So many things it's happening together, and we were thinking of doing education, but it's not only education. We had to handle so many things. So we had rehabilitation plan, and the policy was there on an ad hoc basis. So many ad hoc policies we did, but I would tell you that the policy worked, as Tejendra said, it worked, but we really have to find some way to sustain it all. And Nepal was very much, it has come up from the earthquake, and we were managing the school education after this earthquake when we had to go through another pandemic. So it was like the series of pandemic that Nepal has to go through, and we have been able to. I would say I feel happy that we have been able to really manage some means. There are challenges though, but I would be happy to share some of the success stories that has worked here in Nepal. And one of the story that Tejendra was mentioning about the close users group, that was one of the very good examples that we could do. And Nepal, in coordination with Nepal Telecommunication and Electrical Division and Electrical Authority, and then the Ministry of Education, the three of them came together and developed the means of making the digital framework for the community schools, which is 35,000 plus, which has 9 lakh students over there. And we could develop this closed users group, and they were the one who decided about where would they go for studies and where would they go for discussion, or if they would be doing it from their home, and if they would be sitting under the tree, or they would be going to the ground. So there are 5 different means that we developed during this pandemic to deliver this education. The TV, we did TV, it didn't work well. We did internet, it didn't work well. And all the policies were very much closely working. But I think as the sessions which I had heard from everybody in the session, I'm really very happy to see that this crisis is calling for a collaborative work among us. We have so many experiences, we have got so many good stories and the challenging things, and all of us need to come together and have a really sharing of experiences, and have some joint collaborative work plan, so that we can really build on the lessons which we have learned. Nepal is in crisis not because very much of the reach now, because we have tried and found the way to reach the population, but literacy rate is a question to us. We have it is the girls, and the education of the children is very much the business of women, as there were so many things came up from you all. It's the women, and women's literacy rate in Nepal is it's not even 60%. So that is a challenge to us. Women have not been able to really understand all these technologies, and they have not been really take the ownership of all this technology and take care of the children with all the speed that we have developed through the policies for them. So there is a gap. How do we really meet that gap? There is a community that is illiterate, and the digitalization need literacy. So there is a gap over there, and we need to meet that. And then again, the other thing in the policy, as a policymaker, I have experienced is 20% of the population is only in the urban area. 80% of the population live in the rural areas. So it's the rural is rural, and the COVID vulnerability and all of these challenges coming together has really made it very difficult for them to cope up with everything. Though government of Nepal has tried its best to increase the reach to the people, but it is not the one-way thing that works. The policy and the work plan from the, as you said, from the work plan from the top doesn't work all the time. It has to be the other side as well. The receiver has to be very much ready to receive all these things. And the rural population was not at all in a condition to receive everything that we managed from this end. So there was a gap over there too. So I think there are a few things that we really need to work it out, and how do we really manage those gaps, because if we have to really work in the based on what my studies have shown, if we really want to work for all these things, we have to be very much working with the community people. And Nepal is quite diverse in terms of community and the geography. So one geography, it's COVID-19 in some of the geographical area, the school continued. So it was like the situation it's also demanding, and we have to really work it out what would work and what would not work. And then based on that, the local solutions, finally what government of Nepal as a policymaker, we decided that leave the local authorities to decide what is the local solution for them. And let's facilitate them to find a local solution for them and let them do that. So, and that worked. I tell you, that really worked a lot. So I would not take much time of yours, Karen. I know you have to manage the session, but I'm really thankful to you. And it's because my some urgent reason that I would not be able to continue for the roundtable too. Which I would loved to, and I had committed to. I'm really very happy to hear everybody's voice, and I would try to get into that. But collaborative research would something at this regional level would be very important, and we should, I think, go for that. Thank you very much, Karen, once again. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and we're sorry to miss you out from the next one, but we're pleased that you could share your thoughts. We soon have to wrap up, but I think there's an important comment by Saima Khan, who actually asked or notes, the discourse on education and pandemic highlights how pandemic has created divides or has exacerbated the existing divides. Are there issues in your knowledge where the pandemic has played a role in eliminating the divides? I think this is perhaps an important note also to end this conversation on, because that's also where there might be scopes for positive changes. So I wonder if any of the panelists have brief comments to that. Manjula, I wonder if you would like to step in here, for example, or?
Yes, sorry, I can't open my video. It's locked at the moment. It doesn't matter.
But I mean, this question, whether if you have responses to that, whether there would actually be.
Yes. So I think I mentioned that in my presentation, because you see, I have seen very much, disparities even before the pandemic, the rural, urban, underprivileged, resource, disparities, the socioeconomic, all, even in the smallest country in South Asia, we could see a large number of disparities, and we are struggling with, the education for all. So to reach the education for all, we have glorious, the glorious statistics on literacy. So even those, we are trying to see whether we are realistic about these literacy figures, because we have compulsory education, all that is there as policies, but in reality, the disparities are high. So therefore, I would urge for any innovations, interventions in South Asia, because I have done research in rural areas where I was doing my PhD at the UCL on multi-grade education, where, very small schools are doing education with 1 or 2 teachers only. So still, even after so many years, still those, disparities exist. So pandemic has devastatingly, struck everything, in a very bad way, mainly for them. So the the vulnerable groups will have to be, I don't know what we can do, but you see the challenge is too high to, address without any support, I feel. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Meenakshi had a comment to this question about the possibilities of eliminating divides.
Yeah, I was just thinking the fact that we are all meeting, I think as one of your deputy head of the global division said, that we're meeting online and we can have this kind of a meeting without spending huge amounts of money and on the carbon footprint as well. I think that's one of the greatest contributions of the fact that we can do this on Zoom. So one is that, but for education per se, I think that what I have really found useful is the kind of resource material that many teachers have been able to produce as a result of having to think out of the box and not simply give lectures to students, right, online, but to actually be able to create material that can benefit students from very young kids, from grade 1, 2, 3, 4, right up to grade 12. How can we actually create this? And we have, for example, at Rishi Valley, kept a bank, and I'm quite aware that this is probably something teachers in private schools can do more than teachers in government schools, because we have access to resources, we have access to the internet, we can share and collaborate with teachers in our other Krishnamurti schools and thereby try to develop material. But I think that's one big takeaway from the pandemic. And I think we need to be able to ask schools to do this, higher education as well, to be able to keep the material to show us how, in what ways they've actually been able to enhance learning levels. I think I would like to see that as the positive outcome of the pandemic, because everything else is so debilitating that we tend to somehow miss out on the good material that has been created and is preserved online. So it can be used in the future, even when we are meeting face to face, we can refer to it, we can use those. I think that's one of the things that has been a good. But again, I'm sure it's private schools that have benefited much more than government. Yeah.
Okay, we have to round up in 3 minutes, and there are two raised hands. One is Amina Singh and one is Tejendra. And I think if you can do it within 1 minute, each of you, both of you, then Amina, first you.
So that was a mistake. I just wanted to applaud the point that Meenakshi made about the generation of resources. Thank you.
Okay. Tejendra, that gives you 2
Very
minutes.
quickly. I think, so there's a lot of debate around decolonizing education and reclaiming certain epistemologies, in knowledge production and thinking. I slightly worry about this excessive use of the online resources by teachers in local contexts, as we know that the accumulation of knowledge in the internet is very much dominated by the northern hemisphere and those contexts. And if we really want teachers to be innovative and really develop pedagogical approaches that are locally suited and speak to local contexts and cultures and histories and those nuances, we don't want to bombard them with lots of ready-made materials and information that comes from the West and is produced, in completely different contexts. So I know that there are some opportunities, but I think we need to look at it more critically in order to reclaim this, indigenous epistemological approaches relating to sort of environmental protection, diversity, resistance against consumerism, and all of those things. So I take a slightly cautious approach when it comes to, solving big educational problems. Of course, we as academics have immensely benefited from the online sort of working environments where we are able to connect, but I still want to meet people.
Well, thank you very much. And I think it's time to, unfortunately, to conclude this very interesting discussion. We have 2 days, almost 2 days ahead, where we'll continue a lot of the conversations from now. So I would in particular like to thank the 5 panelists. It has been very interesting, and also the questions that have been raised. Unfortunately, we were not able to accommodate all of them in the debate here, in the conversation, but I hope you'll have a chance to discuss them in some of the other sessions. So thanks for now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karen, for chairing that first roundtable. And thank you to our speakers, Meenakshi, Faisal, Manjula, Nitya, and Tejendra for that excellent discussion. We will now take half an hour break, and we'll be back at 12 with our first 2 paper presentation panels in room A and room B. And the presentation theme in room A is on the theme of space, chaired by Professor David Gellner, and room B is on inequalities and state, chaired by Professor Nandini Gupta. And you can also access these sessions live on our YouTube channel. During the break, we will be posting 2 links to the video presentations that were recorded, video presentations that were submitted as part of this conference. So if you are interested, you could have a look at the 2 playlists, Innovation Spotlight Series and recorded presentations during the break. We will be posting that in our chat, and also it will show on our screen. So see you later after the break, and we will start around 12, after half an hour, 12 o'clock after the break. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you.